You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Don Boudreaux, professor of economics at George Mason University. He blogs at Café Hayek, which I'll link to in the show notes for this episode at economicsdetective.com. Don, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Happy to be here.
Our topic today is civil asset forfeiture. So, Don, start by telling us exactly what civil asset forfeiture is.
It's the practice of the government seizing assets and taking ownership of the assets based upon a suspicion, and what that is varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, based upon a suspicion of wrongdoing without the requirement that the owner of the property be convicted or, in many cases, even charged with wrongdoing. And so it allows the government to seize property without having to go through the processes of getting a conviction.
So that seems a little strange. We usually think of ourselves in the West. I'm in Canada, you're in the United States, but we think of ourselves as having the sort of rule of law where you have a right to a trial, but this violates that. Yes.
And I did some research many years ago on the history of civil asset forfeiture, and it had a reasonably innocent history, but like a lot of these expansions of government power, the initial defendable reason for it got expanded to where it's become completely, in my view, completely indefensible.
So can you take us through some of that history?
Sure. For a long period of time in English law, the government, the Crown, could seize property, take ownership of it, if the owner of the property were convicted of certain kinds of crimes, high crimes, treason, murder. In other cases, the only punishments available to the government to inflict upon the criminal were those that were specified in the common law or in the statutes. You couldn't seize property just above and beyond what was specified in the law. And it's important, it required a criminal conviction before any seizure could take place, which of course required, according to English law, that the owner be within the jurisdiction of the court, because in English law, the owner had a right to face the accuser, in this case, the state. In the mid-17th century, Parliament passed a series of what are called navigation acts. One of the provisions of one of the navigation acts in the mid-17th century was to allow the British government to seize maritime properties, if the ships, mostly, if the owners of those properties were not within the personal jurisdiction of English courts or of British courts. The reason for this statute was that the British Navy was encountering with increasing frequency, pirate ships out to seize, the pirates are out harassing British merchant ships. Britain was a maritime nation, commercial nation. That's how it made its living, and the British didn't like having these pirates take their ships, so the British Navy would go out and they would run these pirates down. Of course, they'd do horrible things to the individual pirates themselves, but the ships were not owned by the pirates. The ships were owned by people in basically in northern Africa, on Barbary Coast. And so the ships would be hauled back to London, and then the British courts, said, well, what do we do with this? We want to punish the owner of the ship, but obviously the owner of the ship is not going to come to London to stand trial. But the ship belongs to that person. We just can't take it. It's sort of a uniquely innocent or formalistic, admirable trait of English legalism. And so the Parliament passed the statute saying, look, if the person who owns the property that is guilty of the wrongdoing is not within the jurisdiction of the English court, then and only then can the government go against the property and accuse the property of being the perpetrator of the wrongdoing. And then if the property is found, the technical term would be liable, not guilty, because it's a civil trial, not a criminal trial. If the property is found liable for the wrongdoing, then the British government can seize it and take it for its own. But notice again the requirement that the owner not be within the jurisdiction of the British courts. That was the origin. So its intent was to enable the courts to do something, enable the British government to handle the seized property in a way that conformed to traditional English legal practice without unduly hamstringing the English government. The English government did not want to stop running down these pirate ships, and they wanted to punish the owners of the pirate ships as much as possible, but they understood the practical impossibility of hauling these owners from Africa into British courts. So that's the origin of civil asset forfeiture. It was taken to the Americas, of course, by the English settlers of what's now the United States and Canada. I think I haven't kept up at all with the course of civil asset forfeiture in Canada. I have kept up with it in the United States. And so civil asset forfeiture was indeed part of colonial American law at the time the U.S. successfully seceded from Great Britain. It was part of early American law at the time the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights were ratified in the late 18th century. But since then, and it was in that form then. It was in the form when, so back then, say in 1790, civil asset forfeiture was used only if the owner of some property, and we're still mostly talking about maritime property, boats. The owner of the property was not within the personal jurisdiction, what the courts would call in personam jurisdiction of the American courts. If the owner was within the jurisdiction of the courts, the government first had to get a conviction, a criminal conviction of that person before that person's property could be seized. The significance of this, of course, is that to get a criminal conviction requires a greater standard of proof under Anglo-American law. It's beyond a reasonable doubt rather than preponderance of the evidence. Persons accused of a crime are entitled to a trial by jury. And so getting a criminal conviction requires a lot more effort on the part of the, rightly so, on the part of the government. And so governments have an interest, if they want to seize property, of being able to avoid having to go the criminal route and to be able to go the civil route, because, in a lot of cases, only under the U.S. Constitution, only human beings, people, flesh and blood people, are entitled to a trial by jury. A boat, an automobile, a house, any non-human entity that's accused of wrongdoing is not entitled to a trial by jury. So even if the property is accused and goes to trial, but there's no jury trial, and the standard of proof is not beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a preponderance of evidence. And so the government had this incentive to, when it wanted to seize property, to push civil asset forfeiture as much as possible, try to expand its scope as much as possible beyond the traditional scope, which again was one in which it was applicable and usable only when the owner of the property was outside of the jurisdiction of the courts.
So they started applying it when the owners were not outside the jurisdiction?
Yes. And my familiarity with the details of the history is a little bit too sketchy to say exactly, to put an exact date on it. It began in the late 19th century in America, when several states in the United States began to enact alcohol prohibition laws. And so stills, illegal stills to make illegal alcohol, were found and seized. And of course, in most of these cases, the owner of the still was not only in the state, in the very county or very town where the still was seized, and so that person was within the jurisdiction of the courts. But the local authorities latched on to latched on to civil asset forfeiture and said, "Oh, let's use civil asset forfeiture here, and they drew some sketchy parallels. Well, the ship out at sea, it was a wrongdoer, and when the government seized it, it didn't have to get a criminal conviction, and that was true. But again, the reason it didn't have to get a criminal conviction was because the owner was not within the jurisdiction of the courts. Starting in the late 19th century, the owners of these stills and of these little boats that would be captured, that were running alcohol up and down the rivers and shorelines of the United States when they were captured, these owners were within the jurisdiction. During national prohibition in the United States, 1920 to 1933, this became a dominant tool used by the government in its anti-prohibition crusade to use civil asset forfeiture against the properties of people violating these prohibition statutes, despite the fact that the owners were in most cases within the jurisdiction of courts. In recent years, the war on drugs, so-called war on drugs, it has become the main arena in which civil asset forfeiture is used. So people get their cars seized, their airplanes seized, cash proceeds are seized routinely because it's suspected of being within the jurisdiction. Because it's suspected of being either, if it's a car or a boat or a house, it's suspected of being party to the wrongdoing. If it's cash, it's suspected of being the proceeds of wrongdoing. And these statutes simply proclaim that if an entity or cash that has any connection with wrongdoing, then civil asset forfeiture applies. If the law enforcement authorities have a reason to believe that there's wrongdoing involved, then it becomes subject to civil asset forfeiture. There's a little ambiguity in the description because there's both federal, in the United States, there's federal civil asset forfeiture law and there's civil asset forfeiture law at the individual state level, and they differ. So in some cases, the owner there's something called an innocent owner defense. The government graciously allows the owner to get his or her property back, or to initiate a proceeding to get his or her property back, if he or she can prove that he or she is innocent. And in some cases, the burden of proof is actually on the owner to prove his or her innocence. In some cases, it's on the government, depending upon the state. It's on the government to prove the owner's guilt if the owner challenges. But in a lot of cases, in all cases, all that is needed for the seizure is suspicion by the law enforcement authorities of wrongdoing, and then the burden shifts to the owner to initiate proceedings, if any at all possible, to get the properties or the funds returned.
It's interesting, with a still during Prohibition, there is no legal use you could be making of a still because alcohol is illegal and the only thing a still does is make alcohol, right?
That's true.
But a car, there are many everyone owns a car, whether they're doing criminal activities or not. So there's kind of a difference there.
Yes, that's a good point. In my view, even the still in the late 19th century, in a state that or a county in which producing alcohol was in violation of the local state legislation, in my view, it still should be the case that if the owner is within the jurisdiction of the courts, the owner there should be first a criminal proceeding against the owner. If the owner is found guilty of committing the crime, then the owner should be fined or pay whatever penalty is specified in the criminal statute. But that's not how it was. The actions went against the legal actions went against the property itself. The legal myth being that the property was the wrongdoer. And so then you have the names of these cases are weird. The United States versus 410 bags of coffee. The U.S. versus, and use the name of some ship, the state of Louisiana versus give the name of some yacht, or the state of Louisiana versus $410,998.42. Weird names of cases, as if the thing itself is the wrongdoer. And again, the real travesty, among many travesties, is that in virtually all the cases now which civil asset forfeiture is used in the U.S., the owner is right there within the jurisdiction, and the courts use the government, the law enforcement agencies use civil asset forfeiture merely as a means of getting around the much more stringent requirements of getting a criminal conviction. So they go the civil route, and that they just seize people's property and take it without having to get a conviction.
Are there people arguing in favor of civil asset forfeiture?
Surprisingly, very few. I've worked on this issue on and off for 20 years. 20 years ago, I should say, I knew a lot more of the details, and I worked on it very heavily about 20 years ago, but I keep up with it still. This is one of these remarkably few issues where there's very little disagreement across the political spectrum. You take a room full of randomly chosen people from the progressive left to the, hardcore, Christian right. Almost none of them, when they hear about civil asset forfeiture, will say, "Oh yeah, that's a good policy." First of all, almost no American knows about it. It's surprisingly unknown. And so when they hear about it, they think that you can't possibly be telling the truth. I've had this experience many times. I'll describe civil asset forfeiture. And they say, that can't possibly be right. I must be exaggerating. I must be lying. I must be telling only part of the story. But it's real. And when people read about it, they're shocked, regardless of their politics. The only people who do defend it are, you won't be surprised to learn, it's major defenders, are law enforcement officials. Because law enforcement, it makes their jobs a lot easier, and civil asset forfeiture has become a major source of funds for them. And there was this tape uncovered just a few months ago of a police officer somewhere in the state of Missouri who was refreshingly frank. He was testifying before some commission, and he was refreshingly frank about how his police department approached and used the civil asset forfeiture proceedings. They target and they look for cars and things that they think are very valuable, and if there's any colorable pretext for concluding that car might have been involved in some wrongdoing, they'll seize the car and then put the burden on the owner to try to get it back. And so if you're a young black man traveling with a lot of cash in a late model luxury automobile, and that's all. That's the only thing the cops know about you. Then they pull you over. They think they have reason to suspect that you're up to no good. I mean, what young black male has a lot of cash and drives a nice BMW or a nice Mercedes-Benz or Lexus? So they'll seize the car, they'll seize the cash. And then it's up to you as the young black male to, if it's possible, for you to prove your innocence, which of course is very costly. And in the United States, you have to pay your own court costs. Assuming if you do win, you're out of pocket for a lot of money. So it's a really appalling practice. So law enforcement agents and officials, they're about the only people who consistently defend it. Legislators, I have noticed, with some exception, are surprisingly quiet about it. They say virtually nothing about it. I'm just speculating here, and this is genuine speculation. I haven't done any research into it, but I have a suspicion that legislators, they have to allocate their budgets to different departments. And to the extent that the police department, the law enforcement agencies, can get their funds by seizing the properties of innocent people, that puts less strain on the town or the state or even the federal budget. And so the legislatures look the other way. They don't need to allocate quite as much money for the law enforcement efforts. They have more money to allocate to other political pork barrel projects. And so the legislators don't have much of an incentive to go against or to try to rein in civil asset forfeiture. Again, there are some exceptions. Back about 20 years ago, the late Representative Henry Hyde of Indiana, who was quite a conservative, he was not a libertarian by any means, but he was a conservative, and he had just this genuine dislike of civil asset forfeiture. He understood genuinely that it was a travesty. And he engaged in an effort to try to rein in federal civil asset forfeiture. He met with some modest success. He got some tweaks to federal civil asset forfeiture legislation that made it a little bit less atrocious than it used to be. But he was the exception. Most legislators are pretty quiet about it. Another reason for that, it just occurs to me, is something I alluded to a moment ago. The fact that most Americans don't know about it means that legislators don't have to pay any attention to it. Legislators are in constant struggle to get elected and to get reelected. And so paying attention to issues about which their constituents pay no attention is not a good bargain for legislators. So they ignore civil asset forfeiture. And the law enforcement agents are clever enough to target groups that tend not to be very politically powerful. I am not one to believe that racism is still the problem in America that it was 50 years ago when Martin Luther King was marching from Selma to Montgomery. I certainly think there have been advances in the U.S. since then. However, there have been. I think it's unquestionable that the way civil asset forfeiture is targeted, it's targeted at Black, it's targeted at Hispanics. It's not targeted at middle-class white Americans. And if it were targeted at middle-class white Americans, then there would be an uproar over it. I'm a middle-class white American. I truly never worry. And I drive a late model Lexus. I don't worry that I'm going to get pulled over by the cops and have my car seized because I look like I might be someone up to no good. If I were a 22-year-old Black man from the inner city, I would worry about that. Middle-class white Americans are much more politically active and politically aware. And so the law enforcement agents don't really go against their properties. They go against the properties of people who have much less political voice, much less political leverage. I think the reason that civil asset forfeiture has gotten more attention in the past year in the United States, really for the first time in my memory, it's gotten some popular attention. And I believe the reason for that is that some law enforcement bureaucracies have gotten a little careless, and they have started, in some cases, to go against middle-class white Americans. And that's very dangerous I think it's a good thing that it's very dangerous for the civil asset forfeiture practice. There was a case in Philadelphia. It's still pending, I believe. I can't pronounce the name. It's a Greek name, Suvarkas, something of that sort. And I may have some of the details wrong, Garrett. It's middle-class white family in Philadelphia. They have a young son, 18-year-old son. No problems with the law ever. The 18-year-old son was indeed caught selling small amounts of, I think it was cocaine, on the front lawn of the family's house. And so the cops, not only did they charge the 18-year-old son with a crime, and the kid's there, he's clearly within the jurisdiction of the city of Philadelphia, but they seize the house of the parents.
So they're not even the ones committing the crime.
They're not the ones who are committing the crime. Their son, who I believe was 18, but even if the son was 17, so he said, well, the parents are responsible for it. I believe the kid was 18. No one suspects the parents of any wrongdoing, perhaps, police your kid well enough. But the legal theory is that the house was guilty. The house is liable for some wrongdoing. The house housed this illicit material, this cocaine. And so because of the house's wrongdoing, this illegal material was enabled to be sold to buyers at that location. And so the government will seize the house and punish the house and protect other Philadelphians from the scourge of this evil wrongdoing house. Of course, in practice, the house is going to stand. If this couple loses the case, the city of Philadelphia will take ownership of the house. They'll sell the house. They will get the proceeds from the house. The house will be then occupied by someone else. So the house is, it's crazy talk when you talk about this, because obviously the house is an inanimate being. It doesn't have any conscience or consciousness. It's not sentient. And the house is not going to be torn down. It's all nutty. The whole fiction that lies behind civil asset forfeiture. But I raise this particular case because this couple, they're challenging it. And when people read about this couple in the newspapers, they look at this couple and they say, "Wow, that looks like us." This is not some foreign-looking couple. This is people that look like, the political elite and politically powerful in America, ordinary middle-class Americans. And now the government's seizing their houses. And I'm sure every middle-class family with a child thinks, well, even though Junior's an angel, it might be that, Junior's, maybe he is selling some pot outside. My gosh, I would hate to have my house seized just because Junior's selling some illicit drugs to some of his friends outside. And so because of that particular case, civil asset forfeiture has gotten more popular attention than it has gotten in the past. Not that it's gotten a lot, but it's gotten more than it has gotten. So what I fear, actually, is that the law enforcement agencies will basically they'll get wise, they'll scale back their efforts, and they'll make sure they continue to harass just politically impotent people like inner city blacks and Hispanics, leave middle class and upper class white people alone, and the properties and lives and livelihoods of many innocent Americans will continue to be put at risk by this awful and deeply, in my view, immoral practice.
What does the U.S. Supreme Court have to say about civil asset forfeiture?
Well, sadly, the U.S. Supreme Court upholds its constitutionality. There have been a number of cases over the years involving civil asset forfeiture. The most recent big case occurred 19 years ago. Actually, 19 years ago, almost to the date. It was in March of 1996. It was called it was Dennis versus Michigan. The facts of this case are pretty straightforward. John and Tina Bennis were a couple living in the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan. John worked at an auto manufacturing plant in Michigan. He and his wife, Tina, jointly owned, I believe it was a 1977 Dodge Dart, not a very valuable car. John went off to work one day. Before he came back from work, he picked up a prostitute on the street, just a hooker, and he was caught having sex with the hooker in the car on the street. It was his first encounter with the law ever. He had before that an unblemished record. He immediately pleaded guilty. He paid the maximum fine of $250. So he pleaded guilty. He was in the jurisdiction of Wayne County, Michigan, which is where this offense took place. And then not long afterward, there was a knock on the Bennis' door, and the Wayne County, Michigan police were there to say, we're here to get your car because your car is a wrongdoer. And Tina Bennis, the joint owner of the car, she said quite believably, she said, well, look, I want you to give me at least my share of the ownership of the car, because it's not like my husband told me before he left in the morning that he was going to have a tryst with a prostitute before he came home from work. I didn't know anything about it. I'm an innocent owner. In Michigan, there's an innocent owner defense. And no, I forget. Maybe there was not even an innocent owner defense. Maybe she was arguing there should be an innocent owner defense. And anyway, this goes to the Supreme Court. And by the 5-4 ruling, the Supreme Court upheld the state of Michigan's seizure of the car and said that the state of Michigan did not owe Tina Bennis even her half of the ownership, even though she was an innocent owner of the car. And the majority opinion was written by then Chief Justice William Rehnquist. And Justice Rehnquist argued quite astonishingly. I mean, it's just amazingly bad history. His argument boiled down to, his argument was, well, look, this is him now. You know, whether we think this is good legislation or bad, the fact is there was civil asset forfeiture as part of the American legal tradition at the time of the adoption of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And so that practice has become incorporated into American law. And so, like it or not, it's part of our legal history. And so it's up to the legislature to overturn it and not the courts. And as astute listeners should be able to tell, the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court got his legal history astonishingly wrong. Yes, there was civil asset forfeiture in 1787 when the Constitution was written, in 1791 when the Bill of Rights in the United States was adopted. But at that time, civil asset forfeiture applied only if the owner of the property was not within the legal jurisdiction of the courts. If the owner was within the jurisdiction of the courts, there could be no civil asset forfeiture. There had to be first a criminal conviction before any property was seized. And in this case, the person, the wrongdoer, the owner of the car, was obviously within the jurisdiction because John Dennis pled guilty and paid to the criminal conviction and paid the fine. And so, according to the precedent that was in place at the time of the adoption of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the basis for using civil asset forfeiture was not available because the owner was within the jurisdiction of the courts. And in this case, the Chief Justice rather blithely said, oh, well, they had something called civil asset forfeiture back then. They call this civil asset forfeiture now. What they call civil asset forfeiture now must be constitutional and legal. It's astonishingly bad legal reasoning, and yet it is the reigning law from the U.S. Supreme Court on civil asset forfeiture. An important and any further, in my opinion, maddening feature of this Dennis case, by the way, it's spelled Dennis for your interested readers, Dennis versus Michigan. An important, the dissenting opinion was written by Associate Justice John Paul Stevens, and he said in his dissent, he said, well, according to the logic of the majority, Chief Justice Rehnquist, according to the logic of the majority, had John Dennis taken his prostitute to a hotel rather than just had sex with her in his car, then it seems that the hotel, that the state of Michigan should be able to seize the entire hotel, despite the fact that the hotel was innocent of any wrongdoing taking place in its rooms. And the Chief Justice responded to this in his opinion, saying, you know, he acknowledged that this is what the dissent says, and he says, well, this is not the case before us, and so we will decide this issue if and when it comes before us. So he didn't even attempt to deny that might be an application of civil asset forfeiture. So it's really quite a scary, I wouldn't call it illegal practice. I think it's better called in the United States. Again, in practice, I don't think that the Hiltons and the Holiday Inns and the Hyatts have to much worry about civil asset forfeiture being used in this way, because if state and federal authorities tried to do it, there'd be such an uproar against it that finally it would get the attention it deserves and it would be reined in. But the horrible consequence, or an additional horrible consequence of it, as I suggested earlier, is that law enforcement agencies tend to target only people in rather voiceless communities, blacks, Hispanics, and they are the main victims of civil asset forfeiture. And they tend to be poorer, obviously, than typical Americans. So you have this bizarre outcome where much of the budget of law enforcement agencies is being funded by proceeds seized from some of the very poorest Americans, in most cases when these people are not even formally accused of any wrongdoing. They're just said to be suspicious in their activities, and that is a sufficiently legal basis under this awful law for having their property seized.
Do you have any final thoughts?
Well, I appreciate your interviewing me on this. I would like knowledge of civil asset forfeiture to be wider. And so any efforts to spread knowledge of it, I applaud. And this is you're doing that with this recording and this podcast. The Institute for Justice, based in Washington, D.C., it's a libertarian public interest law firm. Fortunately, and they're very, very good. Good both in terms of their philosophy and good also in terms of their legal practice. They're very good lawyers. They win a lot of cases. The Institute for Justice has taken it upon itself, has adopted civil asset forfeiture as one of its chief targets to go against. And so I'm hopeful that the Institute for Justice will continue this effort. If anyone is listening and they want to learn more about the current state of civil asset forfeiture litigation, some of the history, they can go to the Institute for Justice's website. It's just ij.org. And that's probably the best place to start to do research on civil asset forfeiture in the United States. I don't work for the Institute for Justice. I don't have any stake in it. I praise them only because I think they are genuinely doing good work on this matter.
My guest today has been Don Boudreaux. Don, thank you for being on Economics Detective Radio.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
If this episode piqued your interest in civil asset forfeiture, you can go over to the show notes page at economicsdetective.com/CAF. That's CAF for civil asset forfeiture, where I'll have a write-up of the episode and everything we talked about, and links to, among other things, all the court cases Don mentioned. I'd also like to thank Stitcher user MathDJ, who recently wrote a nice review. MathDJ wrote, "Great interviews about economics. The informal style of conversations with interesting people makes for a fun listen. I especially like the episode on vampire and zombie economics and the more recent one on experimental economics and norms." Thanks, MathDJ. And a big thank you to Paul and Danica, who both contributed on Patreon. They pledged to give a few dollars each for every episode I release. Paul and Danica are helping to support the show. They're helping me to cover the costs of web hosting and of making the show. And if we get a few more people donating through Patreon, I hope to be able to upgrade my equipment and release episodes more frequently and in even better quality. So thanks, Paul and Danica. And of course, there are lots of ways to support the show. Not all of those ways cost money, so if you want to do that, you can go over to economicsdetective.com/support. And thanks for listening.